remember when it started, only that you've been carrying it for longer than you can explain. A quiet erosion of self, not a collapse, not a crisis, just the slow, steady unraveling of something you once called identity. You learned to perform strength before you understood what strength truly meant. You were taught to be dependable, respectable, agreeable. And so you showed up, you gave, you compromised, you held the storm behind your eyes, and they called it maturity. But beneath the silence, something kept whispering, "This isn't it." Something feels off. You can't name it, and yet you feel it. In the fatigue, in the way you flinch internally when asked for more, in the way love begins to sound like obligation. You didn't ask to be worshipped, only to be seen, to be met, not managed, but instead, what you received was a role, one you didn't write, but one you were expected to master. Protector, provider, unshakable, yet inside, you shake, not with fear, but with the weight of always having to hold the line. Because the moment you falter, they look at you differently. The concern isn't for your soul, it's for the collapse of their comfort. You learn to keep quiet, to not disrupt the emotional equilibrium. You said sorry when you weren't wrong. You gave explanations you didn't owe. You tried to be the better man, thinking that goodness would be recognized. But goodness isn't a currency they honor when comfort is on the line. And you began to notice something dark behind the warmth, that maybe the appreciation was conditional, that maybe your emotional presence wasn't being met, only measured. You asked yourself, is it me? Maybe I'm not enough. Maybe I'm too cold, too tired, too detached. But every time you asked more of yourself, you lost more of yourself. And still, the emptiness remained. Because it wasn't your lack that caused this erosion. It was the game you didn't know you were playing, a game where giving more makes you more forgettable. You see it now, in the moments you gave your vulnerability thinking it would bring closeness. But it only brought distance. You were taught that being emotionally available was the key. But they never told you the cost. That availability would make you predictable. That predictability would make you dispensable. You don't rage, you don't even blame, you just stop expecting. You remember the early days, when you thought love was safety, when you believed reciprocity was natural. You held doors open, not just physically but emotionally. And somewhere along the line, those doors became exits others walked through, leaving you behind with nothing but silence and confusion. And that's where it starts, not with anger but with questions. Why does doing the right thing feel so wrong? Why does trying harder feel like losing more? You weren't weak. You were wired that way, to please, to protect, to prove. But that wiring was never yours. It was installed. And now, you feel the static. This isn't about blame, it's about clarity. Because the truth is, you've been exhausted from holding up a version of yourself they never truly cared to understand. They didn't want your soul, they wanted your compliance. And now, your silence isn't compliance anymore. It's beginning to sound like resistance, like something is about to break, but this time it won't be you. You're not angry, you're awake, and that changes everything. Underneath the surface of what you once called connection, there was always a transaction, not spoken, not written, but enforced. You were told it was love, told it was mutual. But you began to feel the cost long before you could name the exchange. You noticed that appreciation arrived only when you overextended, that peace came only when you remained silent. That validation was doled out based on usefulness, how well you performed, how much you gave, how little you needed. No one said it aloud, but the contract was clear. Be strong, be stable, be available, and in return you might be tolerated. Not cherished, tolerated. You learned to earn affection through compliance, through sacrifice. You learned that your worth wasn't intrinsic, it was measured by your ability to serve. And when you stopped serving, affection vanished like mist. You watched as your emotional labor became expected, not appreciated, as your silence was mistaken for safety, as your devotion was turned into a given. And every time you gave more, it bought you less. Because in this hidden transaction, the more predictable you are, the less power you hold. The more accessible you become, the more easily you are dismissed. You thought vulnerability would bridge the gap, that sharing your truth would create intimacy. But what it did was collapse the illusion of strength they depended on, and in doing so, it shattered their desire. They don't admire who you are. They admire the stability you provide. And when your humanity leaks through, your confusion, your fear, your exhaustion, they recoil, not always in cruelty, sometimes in discomfort, but recoil nonetheless. You began to understand that many relationships are not built on love. They're built on leverage, power, expectation. You were the silent worker beneath someone else's emotional architecture. And when your legs shook under the weight of it, they asked why you weren't stronger. Not why the weight was never shared. There is a difference between love and dependence. Love sees you. Dependence uses you. And somewhere along the line, the two were blurred. Not by malice, but by nature. Survival instinct wears many masks, and one of them is affection. The moment you stop performing, the mask slips. You were told that being needed was an honor. But they never told you that being needed is not the same as being valued. That sometimes, the more someone needs you, the more invisible you become. Not because they don't see you, but because they see only what you give. It wasn't always manipulation. Sometimes it was conditioning, but either way, the result was the same. You forgot how to be whole without being needed. And that's where you lost power. Not when they demanded more, but when you agreed without asking why. But now, the silence returns. And this time it isn't guilt. It's awareness. You don't need to confront anyone. You only need to withdraw. The invisible currency you've been paying with. Your availability, your emotional bandwidth, your need to be needed. There is no revenge here. No war. Just the quiet unraveling of a contract you never signed. A realization that your presence is not a product, that your strength is not a service, and that whoever only values you when you're useful never really valued you at all. There comes a moment when sentiment is no longer enough, when you stop asking what went wrong and start asking what was real to begin with. This is where Schopenhauer enters, not as a voice of comfort, but as a scalpel. His philosophy does not soothe, it severs. And what it severs is illusion. You were taught to see women through the lens of romance, of purity, of soul-level connection. But Schopenhauer didn't see that. He saw nature, dressed in elegance, wrapped in desire, powered by instinct. To him, woman was not a muse or a mystery. She was the will itself, nature's invisible force, using form to seduce function. She does not pursue truth, he said. She pursues advantage, not in cruelty, but in compulsion. The feminine, in his eyes, was not governed by logic or ethics, but by biological strategy, survival, replication, selection. You mistook softness for sincerity, but nature wears beauty the way a hunter wears camouflage. You were told women wanted emotional depth. Schopenhauer told you they wanted security. You were told they seek connection. He told you they seek preservation of self, of lineage, of resource. It isn't evil, it's nature. And once you understand that, the guilt evaporates. You weren't too emotional, you were playing the wrong game. In Schopenhauer's mirror, what you see is not malice, it's neutrality. A force that selects without apology, withdraws without remorse, and evolves without sentiment. The mistake wasn't hers. It was yours. You expected eternity from something wired for adaptation. You brought permanence to a dance designed for seasons. And when the music changed, she moved on. That wasn't betrayal. That was instinct. This is the part where men shatter. Not because they've been deceived, but because they finally realize no one lied. The lies were self-made, romanticized, imprinted by culture, not confirmed by reality. You made her a goddess when she was only ever a mirror. She reflected what you wanted to see until the reflection no longer served her assent. It isn't hatred you feel, it's grief. Grief for the boy who believed in soulmates. For the man who thought emotional labor could replace biological law. For the lover who gave everything and still ended up replaceable. But that grief is a beginning, not an end. Because once you stop looking at women through mythology, you begin to see the system. You stop demanding fairness and start studying patterns. You stop offering unconditional love and start offering selective presence. You no longer chase understanding, you pursue clarity. Schopenhauer didn't want you to hate. He wanted you to see. And what you see now is beyond personal experience. It's archetypal. It's structural. The feminine isn't a flaw in your plan. She is the plan. Nature's gatekeeper, choosing the fittest, filtering the rest. You didn't lose because you were unworthy. You lost because you played the wrong role. You thought this was about love. It never was. It was about leverage, selection, survival. And when you truly understand that, something inside you breaks, and something stronger begins to form in its place, something colder but cleaner. Not bitterness, not detachment, but precision. There's a silence that follows truth, a heavy internal stillness that doesn't speak. It just stares back. That's what comes after you finally see the illusion for what it was. You feel it in your bones. The collapse of a structure you built with sincerity but not with knowledge. Your entire framework of love, of meaning, of what a good man should be, fractured, not by betrayal, but by clarity. And that's the most brutal part. No one destroyed it. It fell apart under its own weight. You mourn a dream that was never real. Not because she deceived you, but because you deceived yourself. You handed over your strength thinking it would earn loyalty. You offered stability thinking it would be cherished. You spoke your heart thinking it would be protected. But none of that was written in stone. None of that guaranteed you a thing. You realize now that what you saw as connection was often convenience. That what felt like reciprocity was sometimes calculation. You begin to see all the moments you tried to earn affection by self-erasure. Every time you silenced your instincts, every time you tolerated disrespect, every time you confused being agreeable with being worthy, you thought you were being noble. But nobility without discernment is not virtue. It's vulnerability in a system that doesn't reward it. And now the old ideals start to die. The belief that love is enough. The hope that consistency guarantees commitment. The idea that emotional transparency builds trust. These weren't wrong. They were incomplete. They were made for a world that doesn't exist. A world where being a good man meant being chosen, being safe, being loved forever. But in this world, goodness is just one more thing to exploit. You don't collapse outward, you implode inward. The loss is private. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It asks why. Why wasn't it enough? Why did loyalty make you forgettable? Why did kindness not protect you? And then it answers, because none of it was about you. It was about function. You were seen not for who you are, but for what you provided. And the moment your offering didn't meet the ever-shifting standard, the devotion disappeared. This is the death of male idealism. The moment you stop believing that effort guarantees outcome, that love conquers strategy, that presence ensures permanence, you see now that many things you called love were conditional contracts. that the pedestal you placed her on was made of your own delusion, and still, you don't hate, you don't rage, you understand. And understanding is lonelier than anger, because it strips away the fantasy, but gives you nothing to replace it. Yet, you sit in the void where your hope used to live, and you feel the weight of starting again, but not as the man you were, not with the same softness, not with the same thirst to be seen. You no longer want to be understood. You want to be undeniable. You no longer crave peace through approval. You crave clarity through power. The fall hurts, but it also frees, because now nothing owns you. Not guilt, not dreams, not the hope that someone might someday finally see your heart and choose it. You stop asking to be chosen. You begin choosing yourself. You don't raise your voice anymore, not because you've made peace, but because you've chosen war of a different kind. Silence is no longer passive. It's deliberate, strategic, final. You used to speak to defend yourself, to explain, to prove your worth. But every word became a leash, every explanation a surrender. So you stopped. Not because you had nothing left to say, but because what you were saying was being used against you. They told you silence was weakness, that not reacting meant you didn't care, but now you see it clearly. Silence isn't absence, it's authority. It's a refusal to be provoked, a rejection of the demand to perform emotional labor you no longer owe. It is the first act of rebellion when a man reclaims his center. Distance once felt cold. Now it feels clean. You don't pull away out of spite. You withdraw because you understand. You've seen the game, you've read the script. You know what happens when you give too much access. Your presence becomes expected, then ignored. Your attention becomes assumed, then exploited. So you retreat. Not with noise, but with precision. You don't block. You don't beg. You vanish. Not to hurt, but to preserve. Not to punish, but to recover the energy you used to give away freely. You stop giving explanations to those who were never listening. You stop filling silences for those who only noticed you when you were gone, and something begins to shift. The power you once outsourced through approval now returns. Not in explosions, but in control. You speak only when it serves a purpose. You reveal only what cannot be used. You respond not to pressure, but to principle. This isn't emotional withdrawal. It's spiritual insulation. You used to think presence was power, that staying meant strength. But now you know that selective presence is the real weapon. Being everywhere made you common. Being everywhere made you predictable. But being nowhere they expect, that makes you unforgettable. You stop being a constant. You become a variable, something that no longer fits into their predictable rhythm. You no longer rush to correct misinterpretations. You no longer fight to be understood. You realize being misunderstood is often safer, more powerful, because they can't control what they can't categorize. And here's what silence teaches you. When you don't respond, they project. They reveal themselves in the space you leave behind. They scramble to interpret the vacuum. And in that scramble, their own patterns are exposed. You don't need to interrogate them. Your silence becomes the interrogation. There is no grand speech, no dramatic confrontation, just a simple truth. You don't go where you aren't met with honor. You don't explain your exit. You don't justify your standards. You disappear from where you are tolerated and appear only where you are respected. That is the new law. This is no longer about who hurt you. It's about who you refuse to become again. And the man you are now, the man who speaks with silence and moves with distance, he is not lonely. He is inaccessible by design. There's a quiet strength in being unknown, in a world obsessed with disclosure, with sharing every thought and feeling for validation. The man who remains unreadable becomes dangerous, not because he's hiding, but because he cannot be mapped. And what cannot be mapped cannot be controlled. You once thought that openness was strength, that vulnerability earned closeness, that if you showed who you were, completely, consistently, someone would see the real you and never leave. But they did, not in spite of your openness, but because of it. Predictability is comforting, yes, but it is also exploitable. And you were exploited. Now you've learned that clarity invites control. The more they know, the more they expect. The more they expect, the more they shape your behavior. You gave them the blueprint, and they rewrote the structure of your soul. Not always with malice, sometimes just with ease. Because when you're readable, you're manageable. When you're known, you're predictable. And when you're predictable, you become dispensable. So you stopped announcing your next move. You stopped narrating your healing, your anger, your sadness. You allowed yourself to become unreadable, not in deceit, but in defense. You learned to withhold, not to manipulate, but to protect your power. Because power isn't loud. It isn't seen. It's felt in the discomfort of not knowing what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you'll do next. You don't explain anymore. You don't clarify your silence. You let them sit in the unknown. Because it's in that unknown that they begin to reveal their assumptions. And their assumptions? That's where the truth always hides. You used to offer everything, your story, your shame, your intentions. Now your presence offers nothing except enigma. You are calm but unreadable, kind but impenetrable, present but unplaceable. And in this transformation, you no longer need to be loved by being understood. You command respect by being untouchable. There is a violence in being too known. It breeds entitlement. They think access equals ownership. They think familiarity gives them permission to direct your emotions. But when you withdraw that access, when you refuse to be decoded, they panic. Because control depends on predictability, and you've erased your patterns. This is not about being fake. This is about being formless. You don't lie. You just no longer narrate. You don't hide. You just no longer perform. You don't react. You observe. And in that observation, you become the question instead of the answer. They will call you distant. They will say you've changed. Let them. You are not here to be understood. You are here to be impossible to dismiss. And unreadability makes you unforgettable. You leave them not with closure, but with curiosity. And curiosity is what keeps power tilted in your favor. You've mastered the art of strategic invisibility. You appear only when it serves you. You reveal only what is necessary, and even in presence, you remain out of reach. Because now you don't need to be known, you only need to be respected. At some point, the game itself becomes irrelevant. The pursuit, the proving, the pattern of trying to decode what someone wants from you, it all fades. Because you stop chasing approval and you start chasing sovereignty. You realize the battle was never about men versus women, dominance versus submission, attention versus affection. It was always about something deeper, the reclaiming of your center, the quiet refusal to let anyone, man, woman, or system define who you are or how you move. You begin to understand that true freedom is not in being loved, it's in being unbothered. Unbothered by praise, unshaken by rejection. You no longer need to react to win. You no longer need to speak to be heard. You no longer need to be needed to feel worthy. You rise above the binary, beyond the tension between masculine and feminine. Because this isn't about gender, it's about energy, integrity, command. It's about becoming untouchable, not because you're cruel, but because you're clear. You are no longer moved by desperation, validation, or fantasy. You are governed by something older, inner law. The man who no longer needs permission becomes dangerous, not to others, but to illusions, to manipulation, to the entire machinery of emotional dependence. Because now, your emotions are not currency. They are sacred, guarded, sovereign. You don't enter dynamics to complete yourself. You enter only when you are already whole. You bring stillness, not hunger, presence, not performance. You are no longer in the market for acceptance. You are the source of acceptance, starting with yourself. This clarity terrifies people because they can't guilt you into staying. They can't confuse you into giving. They can't flatter you into forgetting who you are. You listen, but you don't absorb. You empathize, but you don't lose yourself. You love, but you don't beg. You become the storm that never moves. And in a world that survives by keeping you reactive, your stillness becomes your most radical rebellion. There is no longer a her to impress, a role to fulfill, a game to win. There is only you and the standard you set for your life. You are no longer in negotiation. You are in execution. Either people rise to meet you, or they dissolve in your distance. You've replaced loneliness with solitude, longing with discernment. You know who you are when no one's watching. You know what you're worth when no one is validating it. And that is where your power sharpens into something unshakable. This is not the man who needs to be chosen. This is the man who chooses, who walks into a room not asking what others think, but knowing what he will allow. Because when you stop chasing approval from the world outside, you inherit something far rarer, the right to be untouchable on the inside. You don't walk louder. You walk lighter. Because the burden of explanation is gone. The weight of trying to be enough, for others, for a system, for a fantasy, is gone. And in its place, precision, stillness, an inner clarity that speaks without a sound. This is the final form. Not a louder man, but a quieter one, a man so rooted in himself that no storm can claim him. You've stopped asking to be seen, because now you see yourself. You've stopped proving your loyalty to people who only loved your labor. You've stopped trying to decode mixed signals, because the only signal you follow now is your own. You are no longer trapped in the need to be understood. You have become the one thing this world cannot weaponize, a man who owns his silence. You don't argue, you withdraw, not in weakness but in dominance. Because every reaction used to cost you power, every over-explained truth diluted your stance. Every attempt to be the better man was secretly a sacrifice of your sovereignty. And now you've reclaimed it, not through war, but through refusal. You refuse to be baited by chaos. You refuse to justify your peace. You refuse to entertain what dishonors your standard. And that refusal, that's not arrogance. That's authority. That's what it looks like when a man answers to something higher than approval. When he stops moving for applause and starts moving for alignment. There's nothing left to prove. You don't need to be liked to be respected. You don't need to be desired to feel whole. You don't even need to be remembered. Because you didn't come here to be a memory. You came here to be unchangeable. To become the kind of man who remains himself in any room, with any person, under any pressure. They may not like it. They may call it cold, detached, distant. Let them. Their discomfort is not your disruption. It's the echo of their inability to own what you've already mastered. You are no longer readable, no longer reactive, no longer accessible to anyone who sees you as an emotional vending machine. This version of you doesn't beg for closure. You are the closure. You don't seek revenge. You are the revenge. You don't expose others. You let their confusion speak for itself while you disappear into clarity. You no longer offer your truth where it can be twisted. You no longer stay where your silence is mistaken for submission. Because your silence now has weight. It has edge. It doesn't ask. It declares, and the man you are now, he cannot be owned. Not by love, not by fear, not by hope. He gives what he chooses, to whom he chooses when he chooses, and when he disappears it's not to run, It's to reign. So let the world wonder where you went. Let them reach for your presence like a thing they once had but never respected. Let them talk to your silence, negotiate with your absence, drown in your unreadability, because the final transformation isn't loud, it's absolute, and you now are not just powerful, you are unreachable.